Dawn came slow and pale over the valley, the kind of morning that made the world feel hushed, as if it was holding its breath. 6-year-old Tommy slipped out of the cabin before his papa noticed, barefoot in the grass, chasing the quiet like it was a game. He followed the creek the way he always did, listening for frogs and watching the mist drift above the water. That's when he saw her. A woman crouched behind a cottonwood near the bank, shaking hard like she might fall apart. Her dress was torn, her feet were bare and muddy, and one side of her face was bruised. When Tommy stepped closer, she snapped her head up, eyes wide with fear. "Please," she whispered, voice ragged. "Please don't tell anyone." Tommy stared at her for one long beat, then frowned like he'd found a hurt sparrow in the yard. "Papa fixes broken things," he said simply. He held out his small hand. "Come on." Ariella didn't know why she reached for him. She only knew her legs were trembling too much to hold her, and the boy's hand was warm and steady. He led her across the damp field, chattering in a soft, cheerful voice like he was guiding her through something ordinary. "Sometimes the creek makes my socks wet," he explained. "Papa says I gotta stop stepping in it. But I like it. It's cool." Ariella tried to answer, but her throat felt tight, and every sound she made seemed loud in the stillness. The cabin came into view, a plain log place with smoke curling from the chimney, a small shed off to the side, and a split-rail fence holding back a few sleepy chickens. The sight of it should have brought relief, but Ariella's stomach twisted instead. Cabins meant people, and people meant questions. Questions meant answers she couldn't afford to give. She slowed, her fingers loosening from Tommy's, ready to run even if her body begged her not to. Tommy tugged her again. "It's okay," he said, as if he'd known her thoughts. "Papa ain't mean. He's just big." He grinned up at her like that was the whole of it, and then he pushed the door open without knocking. "Tommy," a man's voice, low and careful. "What did I tell you about?" The words stopped when Eugene looked past his son and saw the woman on the threshold. Eugene Hart stood like he'd stepped into a storm without warning. He was tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a worn work shirt with the sleeves rolled up, dark hair still rumpled from sleep. His eyes moved over Ariella the way a man looks at trouble on the horizon. Quick, sharp, trying to measure distance and danger. He didn't reach for a weapon, but his posture changed all the same, like a gate swinging closed. Tommy stepped forward, proud as a soldier. "Papa, I found her. She was by the creek. She's hurt." He looked back at Ariella, then up at his father. "She said don't tell, but I told you 'cause you fix broken things." Eugene's gaze settled on Ariella's bruised cheek, the dried blood on her lip, the way she kept her arms wrapped around her middle as if holding herself together. She was young enough to still have softness in her face, but there was something older in her eyes. Fear lived there, deep and practiced. "What's your name?" Eugene asked, not unkindly, but with the weight of a man who'd learned to be careful. Ariella swallowed. "Ariella," she managed. Her voice barely carried. "Where are you coming from?" he asked. Ariella's breath caught. The questions were a door she didn't want to open. "Please," she said again, and the words sounded smaller this time, like a child asking not to be punished. I can't." Eugene held her gaze, and something in him softened, just a hair. "All right," he said. "Then we'll start with what I can see." He moved aside. "Come in. Sit down." Ariella hesitated at the threshold, as if the floor might drop out beneath her. Tommy tugged her sleeve gently, leading her to a chair near the stove. The heat from the coals was steady, real. She hadn't realized how cold she was until the warmth touched her skin and made her eyes sting. Eugene filled a tin cup with water and set it in her hands. "Drink," he said, slow. His voice was calm, but his eyes never stopped watching her. Tommy climbed onto a stool like he was part of the grown folks' business. "She needs eggs," he declared. "When I fall, Mama used to give me eggs." Eugene's jaw tightened at the word mama, not with anger, but with the quiet ache of a bruise that never quite healed. He reached for his son's shoulder, gave a squeeze. "Tommy," he said gently, "why don't you go wash up?" Tommy looked torn between obeying and staying close to the woman he'd rescued. "Can I stay right here?" he asked. Eugene's eyes flicked back to Ariella, then down to his son. "Wash your hands and come back," he decided. "Then you can help." Tommy jumped down and ran to the wash basin like he'd been given an important job. Ariella watched him go with something like wonder. She didn't know that kind of trust existed anymore. Eugene crouched beside her chair, careful not to move too fast. "I want to look at your face," he said. "Is that all right?" Ariella nodded, though she wasn't sure she meant it. His hand didn't touch her, not yet. He studied the bruise, the swelling around her eye, the way she flinched when he leaned in. "You been on the road?" he asked. "A while," she whispered. "You hit your head?" He pressed. "No." He rose and went to a small cupboard, pulling out a rag and a jar of salve. When he came back, he set them on the table, keeping space between them. "You can use this," he said. "If you want help, you ask." Ariella stared at him. Most men didn't offer choices. Not the one she'd known. Tommy returned with wet hands and a proud grin. "See? Clean." Then he leaned close to Ariella and whispered loudly, "Papa's the best fixer. He fixed the wagon wheel when it broke. He fixed my kite when it tore. He even fixed the roof when it leaked." Eugene cleared his throat, as if the praise embarrassed him. "I can fix what's in my hands," he said, looking at Ariella again. "But whatever brought you to my creek, I can't promise I can fix that." Ariella's eyes burned. She blinked hard, trying to keep the tears down. "I don't need fixing," she whispered, though she didn't fully believe it. "I just need to be somewhere safe, just for a little while." Eugene's gaze held steady. He'd lived alone long enough to hear the dangers that came with strangers. He'd buried one wife and carried the weight of it every day since. The cabin had been his and Tommy's quiet world for 4 years. Peace was a fragile thing out here, but he also knew what it looked like when someone had nowhere left to go. "How long?" he asked. Ariella's shoulders lifted in a small, helpless shrug. "Until I can stand without feeling like I might fall." Eugene exhaled through his nose, thinking. His eyes went to Tommy, who was watching Ariella like she was a storybook come to life. A child didn't see danger the way a man did. A child saw a hurt person and a chance to help. "You can stay," Eugene said at last, the words firm like a nail driven straight. "Till you're healed." Ariella stared at him as if she couldn't understand what she'd heard. "You don't even know me," she said. "I know you're hurt," Eugene replied. "And I know my boy brought you here. That means something." He glanced at Tommy. "But we're going to do this my way. You eat. You rest. You don't go wandering far. And if trouble comes, you tell me." Tommy bounced on his toes. "See," he said to Ariella. "Told you." The rest of the day moved like a slow river. Eugene made simple food, beans and bread, a little dried meat, while Tommy sat close to Ariella and talked enough for 3 people. Ariella ate carefully, her hands still shaking. After, Eugene showed her a small room off the main space, barely big enough for a narrow bed and a washstand. A quilt lay folded at the foot, faded but clean. "It ain't much," Eugene said. "It's more than enough," Ariella answered, and her voice cracked on the truth. When night came, the wind rose outside, sighing through the cracks in the logs. The cabin smelled of wood smoke and soap. Ariella lay on the bed, staring into the dark, listening to the small sounds of life beyond the thin wall. Eugene moving slow across the floorboards, Tommy murmuring in his sleep. Safety felt strange, like a coat she wasn't sure she had the right to wear. A soft knock came at her door. Before she could answer, it creaked open and Tommy slipped inside, holding something in both hands. He climbed onto the edge of the bed with careful seriousness and placed a small wooden horse beside her pillow. It was smooth from use, the paint worn away on its ears. "My mama used to have bad dreams too," Tommy said quietly, as if sharing a secret. "When she got scared, she'd hold this. Papa carved it for me after." He hesitated, then nudged it closer to her. "You can borrow it. It helps." Ariella's throat tightened. She didn't trust herself to speak, so she simply nodded and pulled the little horse in her hands. It fit perfectly, solid and real. Tommy smiled, satisfied, and slipped off the bed. "Night, Miss Ariella," he whispered. Then, as if the darkness itself might reach for her, he curled up on the floor beside the bed, using his arms for a pillow. Ariella sat up, startled. "Tommy," she whispered, "you should be in your own bed." He blinked sleepily. "Just till you don't shake anymore," he mumbled. "I'm guarding." Ariella looked down at him, this brave little boy who thought he could protect a grown woman simply by staying close. Her eyes filled despite her efforts, and she pressed a hand over her mouth to keep from making a sound. In the doorway, Eugene appeared, drawn by the faint creak of the floor. He took in the scene, Tommy on the boards, Ariella sitting upright with a wooden horse clutched her chest. For a moment, he didn't move. The firelight from the main room touched his face, and his expression shifted in a way that startled him as much as it did her. It wasn't just caution anymore. It was something softer, something almost like hope, creeping in where he'd thought there was no room for it. Eugene's eyes met Ariella's. He didn't speak. He only stood there, looking at his son, guarding her like she mattered. And something inside him gave way, quietly, like a knot loosening after years of being pulled too tight. Morning came soft and slow, sunlight slipping through the cabin cracks as Ariella woke stiff and sore, but warm for the first time in days. The smell of coffee and wood smoke drifting in from the main room. And when she stepped out, she found Eugene already at work, sleeves rolled, moving with quiet purpose while Tommy sat at the table swinging his legs and talking without pause about a bird he'd seen and a frog he wanted to catch later. And before Ariella could stop herself, she offered to help, her voice shy but steady. And Eugene nodded as if it was the most natural thing in the world, showing her how to pump water from the well, how to stir the pot so it wouldn't burn, how to scatter feed for the chickens without letting them crowd her. And she followed his lead carefully, grateful for something to do with her hands, while Tommy trailed her like a shadow, asking questions, laughing when she laughed, and beaming when she braided his hair the way she used to braid her own long ago. And when she stitched a tear in his shirt with practiced fingers, Eugene watched from the doorway, saying nothing but noticing everything. The way she focused, the way her shoulders eased when she felt useful. And later by the fire, he handed her a small carved bird, rough but thoughtful, saying only that it was something to pass the time. And she held it like it mattered, like it meant more than words. And when Tommy asked where she came from, Eugene gently steered the talk away. But she offered a piece of truth anyway, quiet and careful, saying she'd been married once and that he was gone now. And the fire popped softly as no one pushed for more, until Eugene mentioned he needed a ride into Dry Creek for supplies the next day, and her face drained of color, her hands tightening around her cup as she whispered that she couldn't be seen, that she couldn't go anywhere near town. And Eugene met her gaze with a calm she didn't expect, and told her she didn't have to go anywhere she didn't want to, that she was safe here, and something in her loosened at those words. Enough that later, when Tommy made a silly joke about the chickens plotting an escape, she laughed out loud for the first time in what felt like years, the sound surprising even herself. And Eugene noticed, storing the moment away, while the day settled into a gentle rhythm of work and warmth, of shared glances and unspoken understanding, until the sun dipped low and Tommy ran ahead to the window, waving wildly as Eugene saddled the horse for the next day's trip, shouting that they'd bring her something pretty. And Ariella stood watching them go with a tightness in her chest she couldn't name, fear curling beneath the fragile comfort she'd begun to feel, knowing too well that peace like this never lasted. And as the dust settled behind them, she pressed her hand to the glass, silently praying they would come back, unaware that her heart had already started to belong to the small, quiet life she was afraid to want. Dry Creek woke up loud compared to the quiet of the ranch, with wagons creaking, dogs barking, and folks calling to one another like the whole place ran on noise. and Eugene kept his face plain as he rode in with Tommy perched behind him, because a man learned quick that attention could turn into trouble, but it didn't take long before he felt eyes on him anyway. The general store bell jingled when they stepped inside, and the shopkeeper, Mr. Lyle, lifted his brows at the sight of Tommy, grinning ear to ear like Christmas had come early, saying, "Morning, Eugene." Boy looks happier than a pup with two tails, and Eugene answered with a small nod, gathering flour and coffee and nails, trying to keep the visit short, but over by the bolts of cloth a few women paused mid-whisper, and Eugene caught the edge of it like a thorn. "There's a woman at his place," one murmured, and another said, "Unmarried too, I heard," and Eugene's shoulders tightened as he set a sack on the counter, his jaw working like he was chewing on something bitter. And when one of them turned and smiled too sweetly, asking, "Eugene Hart, who you got staying out there?" It didn't blink, only said, "Family friend passing through," in a voice that made it clear the subject was done, but gossip didn't care about clear lines. It slipped around them like smoke, and while Eugene checked his list, Tommy wandered toward the candy jar and the little rack of picture cards near the counter where the shopkeeper's daughter, Millie, stood sweeping, and in that bright, innocent way children had, Tommy announced, "We got a nice lady at our cabin. She tells stories and fixes my shirt holes, and she laughs at my jokes." And Millie's eyes went wide, delighted, as if this was the best news she'd heard all week. And Eugene turned too late, seeing the words already flying out of his son like tossed seeds. And he stepped in quick, saying, "Tommy, come here." But the damage was done because Millie giggled and called to her mother, and her mother's head snapped up like a hawk's spotting movement. Eugene paid and left fast, hauling the supplies. Outside, and he was strapping them down when the sheriff approached, Sheriff Callahan, a decent man with a weathered face and a calm way about him, the kind who didn't look for trouble but didn't step aside from it either. And he tipped his hat to Eugene, then lowered his voice. "Heard you been seen with a stranger lately," the sheriff said, and Eugene's gut went cold. "Folks talk," Eugene replied carefully, keeping one hand on Tommy's shoulder as if the boy might bolt into the street. The sheriff didn't smile. "This ain't only talk," he said. "Man came through yesterday, asking questions. Said he's looking for a runaway woman. Gave a description that might fit someone." Eugene's eyes narrowed. "What man?" he asked. "Didn't give a name," Callahan said, "but he claimed the woman belongs with her late husband's family. Says she owes debts. Says she took off and left responsibilities behind." Eugene felt anger rise hot and sharp, because he could hear the shape of a lie even without seeing it. And he asked, "You tell him anything?" The sheriff shook his head. "Told him I don't help folks hunt women like their livestock," he said plainly. "But I figured you ought to know. He said he's from 3 towns over, and he's asking around." Eugene kept his face steady, but inside his mind ran fast, measuring distance, timing, risk, and when he mounted up with Tommy, the boy chattering about a ribbon he wanted to buy for Miss Ariella because she likes pretty things, Eugene's heart sank, because even a sweet thought could pull a thread that unraveled everything. The ride home felt longer, dust thick in the air, and Eugene's thoughts stayed dark and heavy. And when the cabin finally came into view, Ariella stepped onto the porch like she'd been waiting the whole day, her hands clasped tight, reading his face the second he looked up. And she didn't ask about supplies first, she asked, "What happened?" And Eugene forced his voice calm for Tommy's sake, making supper like normal, listening to the boy talk and talk until his eyelids drooped, and Eugene carried him to bed. And only when the cabin went quiet did Eugene sit with Ariella by the low firelight and tell her what the sheriff said. Ariella's breath hitched, her fingers twisting in her lap, and for a long moment she stared into the flames like she was watching her own past burn there. Then she whispered the truth in small pieces, like each one cost her something. She'd been married, yes, but hadn't been kind, and her husband had died in an accident. Thrown from his horse, gone too quick, and his family had turned on her like wolves, blaming her, saying she'd brought bad luck, saying she owed them money she'd never borrowed, all because she'd inherited a small patch of land and they wanted it. and the only way they could take it clean was if she was scared enough to give it up or trapped enough to lose it. So she ran with nothing but her life. Eugene listened without interrupting, his hands clenched so hard his knuckles went white, not because he doubted her, but because he believed her, because he'd seen fear like that before, and it didn't come from made-up stories. And when she finally said, "I shouldn't have come here," Eugene's voice came out low and rough. "You didn't bring trouble," he said. "Trouble found you. There's a difference." Ariella looked at him, eyes shining, and whispered, "They'll come. They'll ruin you." Eugene leaned forward, the fire catching in his gaze, and said, "They'll have to prove whatever claims they're barking about. And until then, you're safe here." And his hand lifted like he meant to touch hers, but he stopped short, the distance between them suddenly loud. And still he said, quiet and sure, "I won't let them take you." And Ariella's chest tightened so hard it hurt, because no one had ever said that to her like it was a promise instead of a bargain. The next morning, before the sun was fully up, Ariella heard small sobs and stepped in the main room to find Tommy sitting on the floor with his wooden horse in his lap, tears sliding down his cheeks. And when she knelt beside him, he grabbed her sleeve like he was afraid she might vanish if he let go, whispering, "Papa said bad men might come. I don't want you to go." And Ariella pulled him in her arms, holding him close while her own fear rose like a tide. And she whispered back, "Shh, I'm here," even as she wondered if she could keep that promise at all. Over the next 2 weeks, the cabin slowly changed in ways none of them spoke about, but all of them felt, as if a quiet rhythm had settled in and decided to stay, with Ariella rising early to help before being asked, learning how Eugene liked the coffee strong and how Tommy liked his eggs soft, walking with them to the creek where she laughed when Tommy showed her how to fish and nearly fell in herself, her laughter ringing out surprised and bright. And in the afternoons, she helped mend fences or sort grain, her hands moving with purpose as if work itself steadied her. While Eugene found himself watching small things without meaning to, the way she hummed under her breath when she thought no one listened, the way she brushed dirt from her skirt before stepping inside, the way she knelt to meet Tommy at eye level when he spoke, never brushing him off, and in the evenings they sat by the fire with Tommy between them, the boy acting as if this had always been how families were made, telling stories he half invented, asking questions that made Ariella smile and Eugene pause, and sometimes their hands brushed when passing a cup or a plate, neither pulling away too fast, both pretending it meant nothing when it meant more than either wanted to admit. And Tommy noticed everything, drawing pictures in the dirt of 3 stick figures holding hands, proudly announcing that it was his family, asking Eugene if Ariella could stay forever. And when Eugene told him gently that it wasn't his choice, Tommy ran straight to Ariella and declared, "I wish you were my mama," which broke something open in her chest she hadn't known was still whole, tears slipping free as she hugged him and told him it was the kindest thing anyone had ever said to her. While Eugene watched from the doorway, heart pounding, knowing he was already standing on ground that could shift beneath him. Word began to drift in from the outside world as it always did, carried by church ladies who stopped by with forced smiles and sharper eyes, their polite questions wrapped in judgment. And though Eugene answered them calmly, his stance never wavered, making it clear Ariella was under his roof and his protection. But the whispers lingered, and Ariella heard them, felt their weight, and guilt crept in alongside comfort, because she knew peace borrowed could be taken back, and she began to wake earlier, linger longer over chores, as if memorizing the feel of this life. The way the sunlight slanted across the table in the morning, the sound of Tommy's boots thudding across the floor, the steady presence of Eugene moving nearby. And in the quiet moments, she admitted to herself what her heart already knew, that she was falling for them, for the safety, for the laughter, for the man who never raised his voice, and the child who loved without caution. And that knowledge scared her more than the man who hunted her ever had, because it meant there was something to lose. And so she began to plan in silence, gathering her few things, thinking of roads and distances and how to leave. without breaking what she'd found, telling herself it was the only way to protect them. And it was during one of those quiet evenings, when the sky burned orange and gold and the air smelled like dust and coming night, that Eugene stiffened suddenly, eyes narrowing toward the ridge, his hand lifting as if on instinct. And Uriella followed his gaze to see a lone rider silhouetted against the fading light. Too far to make out details, but close enough to raise dread, and Eugene's voice dropped low, and firm as he said, "Get inside. Take Tommy." And her heart stuttered as fear surged back full force, because she knew, deep down, that peace had an end, and whatever she'd been running from was finally close enough to cast a shadow. The rider on the ridge turned out to be old Mr. Carden from the neighboring ranch. Nothing more than a man looking to trade news and borrow a tool. And Eugene let out a slow breath he hadn't realized he was holding, trying to laugh it off for Tommy's sake. But Uriella's knees still felt weak long after the hoofbeats faded, because the fear wasn't about who it was about how fast her heart had believed it could be them. And that night, while Tommy slept curled up with his wooden horse and Eugene moved around the cabin in quiet, steady motions, Uriella sat on the edge of her bed and finally admitted the truth she'd been circling for days. She couldn't stay and keep them safe at the same time, not if Marcus, or anyone like him, kept sniffing around, not if town talk kept spreading, not if Eugene kept having to square his shoulders against trouble that didn't belong to him. She told herself she was being brave, that leaving was the right thing, that love didn't always mean holding on. Sometimes it meant letting go before you ruined the people you cared about. And still her chest ached like she was pulling out something stitched in her ribs because the cabin had started to feel like a home, and that was the most dangerous feeling of all. She waited until the cabin was deep asleep, until the fire had burned down to a red, sleepy glow and even the wind outside seemed to quiet. Then she lit a candle and packed the few things she owned into a small bundle. Her worn shawl, a spare dress, the little carved bird Eugene had given her, and the tiniest bits of comfort she couldn't bear to leave behind, and every soft rustle of cloth sounded too loud. Every creak of the floor made her freeze, because the last thing she wanted was Tommy, waking and seeing her go. But when she glanced at a small shape in the other room, she saw the way his fingers curled around that wooden horse like it was a promise. And her eyes stung so hard she had to press her palm to her mouth to keep from making a sound. At the table, she laid out 2 pieces of paper Eugene had brought home from town. Rough, cheap sheets meant for lists, not heartbreak. And she stared at them until the candle flame wavered, because words felt too small for what she needed to say. But leaving without them felt crueler, and finally she wrote in careful strokes, 1 note for Eugene and 1 for Tommy, her hand shaking only once, where she wrote the part that mattered most. To Eugene, she wrote that he and Tommy deserved peace, that she couldn't repay the kindness they'd shown her, that she had forgotten what it felt like to be treated like a human being, not a burden, and that if trouble came to their door, it would come because of her. And she couldn't let that happen. She didn't write, "I love you," because that word felt too heavy to leave behind on paper, but she wrote, "Thank you for showing me kindness still exists." And she hoped he would understand what she couldn't bring herself to say outright. To Tommy, she wrote in simpler words, because he was small and pure, and she didn't want her goodbye to confuse him. And she told him he was the bravest boy she knew, and that he should keep the wooden horse safe because it meant she would always remember him. Always. And she added a line about how some people had to go on a journey for a little while, but that didn't mean their hearts stopped caring. And she prayed he would feel the love beneath the sadness. When the notes were done, she folded them neatly, set them where Eugene would see them first thing, and then, after a long pause, she lifted the wooden horse from Tommy's hands and placed it on the table too, not because she wanted to take it away from him, but because she couldn't bear to leave with the one thing that had been offered like comfort. It felt like leaving a piece of him behind for him to find. A silent way of saying she'd held on to their kindness as long as she could. She stepped outside before dawn, the sky still dark and wide, stars fading slowly as a thin gray light crept up from the horizon, and the cold hit her cheeks like a slap. making her lungs burn, but she kept walking, bundle tucked tight, boots she'd borrowed laced firm, her mind chanting the same hard sentence over and over. Don't look back, because if she looked back, she might crumble right there in the yard like a dropped cup. The cabin behind her stayed quiet, and for a few precious moments, she almost believed she'd gotten away clean. But inside, not long after she'd gone, Tommy stirred the way children do when the world feels different, blinking into the dim light and calling out for her without fully waking. Then sitting up suddenly when he realized the cabin sounded wrong. Too empty, too still, and he padded into the main room with his hair sticking up and his eyes sleepy, and he froze when he saw the table. The candle stub, the folded papers, the wooden horse. "Miss Uriella," he whispered, voice cracking like a twig. He ran to the porch, barefoot on cold wood, scanning the yard with wild hope. Then he turned and bolted to Eugene's room, shaking his father's shoulder with small, urgent hands. "Papa," he cried, the tears coming fast now. "She left. Papa, she left us." Eugene jolted awake, heart already dropping before he even stood up, because he heard it in his son's voice, the kind of hurt that didn't come from scraped knees. And when he crossed into the main room and saw the notes and the horse, something in him went tight and sharp, a pain so sudden it made him stand still for half a breath. He read Uriella's note once, then again, slower the second time, hearing her voice between the lines, seeing the shape of her fear and the shape of her love. And when he looked up, Tommy was staring at him with a child's whole world trembling in his eyes. "Didn't she love us?" Tommy asked, and it nearly broke Eugene clean in half. Eugene swallowed hard, crouched down, and cupped Tommy's cheeks the way he used to when the boy had nightmares. "She loves you," Eugene said, steady even as his throat burned. "She loves us both." Tommy shook his head fiercely, tears shaking loose. "Then why'd she go?" he demanded. Eugene looked at the note again, and the truth hit him like the crack of a rifle. She didn't leave because she didn't care. She left because she cared too much and thought she was poison. And Eugene felt a quiet anger rise, not at Uriella, but at the people who had taught her that love meant running, not staying. Tommy wiped his face with the heel of his hand and said with the kind of simple courage adults forget, "We gotta bring her back. I already chose her, Papa." And Eugene's breath caught, because in that small sentence was everything he'd been afraid to admit. He glanced toward the door, as if he could see Uriella's footprints in the dark, and then he nodded once, decision slamming into place like a bar across a door. "You're right, son," he said. "So did I." Eugene moved fast then, the way a man moves when he's done thinking and ready to act, saddling his horse with practiced hands, strapping a small canteen and a blanket, then bringing out Tommy's pony, because he saw the fight in the boy's face and knew he couldn't keep him back without tearing something important. "You stay close," Eugene ordered, voice firm. "You do exactly what I say." Tommy nodded hard, climbing up like he'd been training for this his whole life. They rode out into the pale light, following the dirt road that led toward town, Eugene scanning the ground until he found what he needed. Soft marks where someone had walked with purpose, one foot dragging slightly when the ground dipped, the faint edge of a heel print where the road turned. And they followed those signs like they were a trail of breath, pushing their horses faster, the wind cold against their faces, Tommy gripping the reins with small knuckles white. And after what felt like forever, they crested a low hill and saw her down in the valley below, a lone figure walking with her bundle, shoulders squared like she was holding herself up by will alone. Relief surged through Eugene so strong it made his eyes sting, and he kicked his horse forward, about to call her name, when movement caught his attention on the far side of the road. Another rider approaching from the opposite direction, coming from town, riding hard and straight as an arrow. Eugene's stomach turned, because he recognized the man even from a distance, the set of his shoulders, the way he sat his horse like he owned the land beneath it, and Eugene's voice snapped sharp with fear. "Ride fast, Tommy," he shouted, because Marcus was closing in, and Uriella didn't even know she was about to be caught between them. The valley opened wide and empty around Uriella, the road stretching ahead like it didn't care who walked it, and she kept her eyes forward because if she looked back she might see the cabin in her mind and lose her nerve. But then she heard it. Hoofbeats, fast and urgent, not the slow, lazy sound of a neighbor passing by, and her whole body went cold, because fear has a way of recognizing its own long before the mind can catch up, and she turned just as a small pony came pounding toward her with Tommy on its back, his face red from wind and worry, shouting her name like he'd been calling it 100 miles. "Miss Uriella," he cried, and before she could speak he slid down, ran to her, and grabbed her hand with both of his as if he could anchor her to the earth. "Don't go," he said, voice breaking. "Please don't go." Uriella's chest tightened so hard she could barely breathe, because she'd thought leaving would be clean, quick, a single sharp cut, and instead here was the pain walking right up to her in child's hands. "Tommy," she whispered, sinking to her knees so she could meet his eyes, trying to smile through the tremble in her mouth. "You shouldn't be out here. It's not safe." Tommy shook his head hard enough his hair fell into his eyes. "It ain't safe without you," he insisted, and she almost laughed and cried at the same time, because it was such a Tommy thing to say. Too big, too honest. Then another horse thundered closer, and Eugene came into view, reins tight, jaw set, eyes fixed on her like he'd been chasing more than a runaway. And he swung down before the horse had fully stopped, stepping between Uriella and the open road, his body positioned the way a man stands when he's decided something and won't be moved. "You're not going anywhere," Eugene said, voice low and steady, and Uriella flinched at the gentleness in it, because it felt like being offered water when you expected a whip. She stood slowly, her fingers still curled around Tommy's, and she tried to summon the strength to insist, to push them away for their own good. But even as she opened her mouth, she heard another set of hoofbeats from the other side, heavier, colder, coming fast, and when she turned she saw the rider approaching like a storm wearing a man's shape. Marcus. He reined in a few yards away, his horse dancing beneath him, and his eyes swept over Uriella with a look that made her skin crawl. Ownership dressed up as righteousness. "Well," Marcus called, voice sharp with satisfaction, "there you are." Tommy stepped closer to Uriella like a shield, small but fierce, and Eugene didn't move aside an inch. Marcus's gaze flicked to Eugene, contempt curling his mouth. "You," he said, like Eugene was a nuisance on the road. "Step away from my sister-in-law." Eugene's eyes stayed calm, but the muscles in his neck tensed. "She's not property," Eugene replied. Marcus laughed once bitter. "Tell that to the law," he snapped. She ran off. "Left debts, left responsibilities, left what belongs to my family." Uriella's stomach twisted, the old fear rising, but she lifted her chin because she was tired of being small. "Your family wants my land," she said quietly. That's all this ever was. Marcus's eyes narrowed, and for a moment his voice turned silky, dangerous. "You can come back the easy way," he said, "or you can come back with a sheriff's hand on your arm. Folks already think you're a thief. You want to make it true." Eugene took one step forward, a warning in the movement. "Any claim you think you got can go through proper channels," he said. "You don't get to corner a woman on a road and call it justice." Marcus's lip curled. "Proper channels?" he echoed. "This is frontier country, cowboy. Men handle their own." Eugene didn't blink. "Not like that," he said, and the quiet force in his tone made Marcus's horse toss its head. Uriella's hands were shaking now. Not from the cold, but from the weight of the moment. The way all roads seemed to lead back to being dragged, blamed, punished. And she looked at Eugene and saw what it would cost him to keep standing there. Saw the way town talk could turn into threats. Saw Tommy's wide eyes watching every breath. And the old habit of sacrifice rose in her like a command. "Send me back," she whispered, voice cracking as she forced the words out. "Please, Eugene, don't ruin yourself for me." Eugene's face tightened, something raw passing through his eyes, and then he glanced down at Tommy, who was clinging to Uriella's hand like his life depended on it. Eugene's voice came out steady, but it carried like iron. "My boy already chose you," he said, and Uriella's breath caught. "And so did I." Tommy stepped forward then, shoulders squared in a way that made him look older than 6, and he pointed at Marcus with trembling courage. "She's my family now," he declared. "You can't take her." Marcus sneered, looking down at him. "Boy, get out of this," he said, dismissive. Eugene's hand hovered near Tommy's shoulder, protective without pushing him back, and Eugene's eyes stayed locked on Marcus. "She stays unless she chooses otherwise," Eugene said. "You don't get to force her. You don't get to scare her. You don't get to decide her life." Marcus's expression darkened, rage flashing. "You'll regret this," he said, leaning forward in the saddle. "Sheriff will hear about it. The town will know you're harboring a thief." Eugene's voice didn't rise. "Let them hear," he replied. "I'll tell the truth. All of it." Marcus glared at Uriella one last time, like he was carving the moment into his memory, then yanked his horse around hard, kicking up dust as he rode off, his parting promise hanging in the air without needing words. Uriella's knees went weak the second he left, relief and fear tangling so tightly she couldn't tell one from the other, and she swayed before she could catch herself. But Eugene was there in a heartbeat, arms steadying her, holding her like she wasn't a burden but something worth protecting. "I've got you," he murmured, and Uriella's eyes filled as she clutched his shirt for one brief second, unable to pretend she didn't need that kindness. Tommy looked up at them, voice small again now that the danger had passed. "Is he coming back?" he asked. Eugene's gaze followed the fading rider, then returned, calm and resolute. "Let him try," Eugene said, and the way he said it made Uriella believe, for the first time, that running didn't have to be her only answer. They rode back to the cabin with the sun dipping low, Uriella shaking so hard she could barely hold the saddle horn, and Eugene kept one hand near her the whole way like he could steady her without saying a word, while Tommy rode close on his pony, watching her like he was afraid she might fade into the evening air. And once inside, Eugene set a kettle on the stove and made tea the way his late wife used to, simple and warm, then sat across from Uriella at the table until her breathing slowed, telling her in a voice that left no room for doubt, "We face this together. No more running." And those words settled over her like a quilt, heavy and comforting at once. The next morning, Eugene rode into Dry Creek with his back straight and his mind set, walking into the sheriff's office like a man who had decided the truth was the only weapon he needed. And Sheriff Callahan listened without interrupting as Eugene explained who Uriella was, what she'd survived, and what Marcus had tried to do. And when Eugene finished, the sheriff leaned back with a hard look and said he'd look into the so-called debts, because men who relied on threats often crumbled under questions. By afternoon, the shopkeeper confirmed Uriella had never stolen a thing from anyone in Dry Creek, and the doctor who had quietly treated her bruises after Eugene first brought her supplies vouched for her condition and her fear, and piece by piece the story lined up until Marcus's claims started to sound like what they were: a man tried to steal land by bullying a woman who had nobody to stand beside her. When Marcus returned later, jaw tight and eyes sharp, expecting the town to back him, he found the sheriff waiting with a colder kind of welcome, explaining that there was no lawful paper that forced Uriella to go anywhere, no court order, no proof of wrongdoing, and that if Marcus wanted to pursue it, he'd have to do it proper, and even then he'd better mind his manners, because threats weren't evidence. Marcus's face went stiff with anger, but it was the kind that had nowhere to land, and after one last look toward Eugene, pure resentment, he mounted up and left Dry Creek with his pride bruised and his plans broken, his threats turning empty the farther he rode. When Eugene returned to the cabin at dusk, Uriella met him on the porch, her hands clasped so tight her fingers were pale, and he didn't make her wait. He told her she was free, truly free, and the sound of that word made her eyes fill as if her body had been saving tears for this exact moment. Still, once the relief settled, a quiet question remained between them, hanging in the spaces where fear used to live. What now? That evening, after Tommy fell asleep inside with his blanket kicked half off the bed, Eugene and Ariella sat on the porch in rocking chairs, listening to crickets and the soft creak of wood, and Eugene stared out at the dark field for a long time before he finally said, almost awkward, "Been thinking." And then he pulled something small from his pocket, a simple ring that caught a bit of lamplight, and his voice turned careful, respectful. "This was Sarah's," he said. "She'd have wanted it to go to someone who'd love Tommy like their own." And Uriella's breath caught as she looked at the ring and then at him, realizing he wasn't offering rescue anymore. He was offering belonging. "I know it's fast," Eugene went on. "I know folks will talk. But if you're willing, would you marry me?" Uriella's tears spilled before she could stop them, and she whispered, honest and scared, "I have nothing to bring to this." And Eugene reached across the space between them, taking her hand with a steadiness that felt like home. "You already brought everything," he said. "You brought life back." And when she nodded yes through shaking tears, Eugene leaned in and kissed her gently, like a promise kept, not a claim made. And inside the cabin, the wooden horse sat on the mantel, watching over the quiet, as if even the smallest things knew the running was finally over.